So there's an old story about a monk who lived on a mountainside. And one night, he's standing in front of his very modest hut, and he's looking out at this beautiful night sky, this panorama of stars with this great big round shimmering moon. And as he sits there regarding this moon, a thief approaches him. And the thief grabs the man and he says, "Give me everything you own and I will spare your life." And the monk says, "You can look in my hut. I don't really own anything. I mean, all I own are the clothes I'm wearing." And the thief says again, "Give me everything you own and I will spare your life." And so the monk takes off his clothing and gives it to the thief, and the thief vanishes into the darkness of the mountain. And as the monk sits there, naked, shivering on the mountainside, he looks up at the sky and he says, "What a poor man that thief is. I wish I could give him this beautiful moon." Now that's a story from the Zen Buddhist tradition, and the moral of that story for us this morning anyway is to recognize that the thief couldn't really see, couldn't really know that moon. We can't know what we're not ready to know. So all of this comes back to where we are right today in the United States, the questions that I think so many of us are holding. Why do people here see and know and experience things so differently? How can we look at the same moon and see it so differently? But that feels like what is happening right now, whether it's the pandemic or elections or trans people or federal troops descending upon cities. We have some people who see it this way and other people who see it that way. And we wonder, how can we possibly hold such disparate views? And we ask, why can't people see what we see? How come they can't know it the way that we know it? I mean, surely on Monday night when we all go outside and we look up at that moon, we'll see the same thing, right? But the answer is we don't really see the same thing. So this reminds me of a story of a few years ago, as the pandemic had been around for a while, and I really felt like I was in a physical slump. And so I decided to get a personal trainer to keep me accountable and do some self-care. So I showed up at this gym with this trainer, and we had a really good half a session or so, and then I made a really huge mistake. He asked me what I did for a living, and I told him the truth. And suddenly, I no longer had a personal trainer, but I had my one congregation of one there each time I went. So eventually, bless him, I had to get a different trainer. But I heard a lot about his life, even as I was trying to work out. But he told me about being an immigrant. He told me about joining the U.S. military. He told me about some of the traumatic experiences he'd had in the military. He told me about his PTSD. He told me about the lowest moments that he'd had in his life. And he told me about the framework that had carried him through all of that to where he was that day. And what he said to me was that in his darkest moments, in the times when he felt like he had nothing, when he was absolutely at the very end of possibilities for himself, he had considered doing things, terrible things, criminal things, self-harm, all kinds of things that he was embarrassed to share. But he shared with me where he was at in those moments, and he said the thing that stopped him from doing those terrible things was the fact that he believed that God was watching him. And not only was God watching him, God was judging him, and God would punish him if he did those things. And so he didn't do them. And he was grateful for that punishing God because it had stopped him from doing things that were terrible. Now, again, I'm trying to, row or whatever I'm trying to do here, and I'm listening to all of this, and I'm thinking, at the minimum, I'm a universalist minister. If I'm going to subscribe to a belief in a God, it's going to be an all-loving, all-forgiving God. What do I say to this man? And then at the same time, I'm thinking, this man just told me how this framework had saved his life. And how can I just poo-poo that? And what I recognized was that this was the framework that he had been given. This is the framework that his family held, that his community held. It really was the only option that he'd ever been given in life for understanding faith and God. And so he had used it in those moments to get him through those terrible times. And who was I to say that he was wrong for that? Do I wish that he'd had healthier, what I consider healthier options of a framework for faith during those times? Absolutely. But the truth is he didn't. And he'd found a way to make it through. I think these kind of experiences have made me more compassionate sometimes to the differences in the way people are framing their existence, the way that they're seeing and knowing what's happening. And there's something I want to take you through here that I think is really helpful. It's been helpful for me. It comes from a man named James Fowler. And back in 1981, he wrote a book called The Stages of Faith Development. And he was drawing upon the work of people like Piaget and Kohlberg, who had done stages of moral and cognitive development. And he'd done a lot of research over the years and interviews and so on. And Fowler came up with this book that details these different stages of faith development that people are in. And the very first stage that they're in is one called the intuitive projective stage. And this is a stage that usually kids, maybe ages 3 to 7 are in, but this can be beyond any particular age range. And this is the stage marked by magical thinking. And so at this stage, if we continue with our moon as a metaphor today, this stage might be where this child looks up at the moon and they think they see a face there, and they think it's smiling at them. And so they believe, naturally and easily, the moon is smiling at me and shining on me, and that's their belief. And they hold on to that very simple, magical belief. Until maybe 7 or so, 7 to 11, they start moving into the stage that we call the mythic literal stage. And this is a stage where stories and myths are what grounds their understanding of faith. So now, if they believe there's a man in the moon, it's because they've been told a story about the man in the moon. And so they've integrated that story into that, and that's why they believe there's a man in the moon. It's not just because it looks like there's a man in the moon to them. It's because they're hearing stories and myths that tell them that. And so this is a stage that, again, 7 to 11 years old, but we can also see some adults are going to be in that stage of faith development. The third stage is the most common stage to find, I think, people in, especially in American culture, and it's the synthetic conventional stage. These are really catchy stage names, right? But this is around the adolescent period, and this is the period where it's all about what the group or community thinks. So if your pastor or your church tells you something about the moon, that's what you believe. And you keep believing it. And if you have a healthy set of dynamics happening in a community like that, then this can be a fairly healthy way to be, because you're surrounded by people who support you, who think similar things, and what happens in that community can be affirmed by your daily life and experience. The problems with being in this stage start occurring when maybe you start questioning the beliefs of the group. You no longer fit in as easily. You maybe start analyzing it with critical thinking skills and start questioning, well, that doesn't really make sense about the moon, and I think the moon is just the moon, and so on. And it's not something that you can share within that group. So you might have to actually move out of it and say goodbye. This particular stage is one I feel like I know really well coming from the family that I come from. A few years ago, my cousin and his wife made national headlines because their infant child died from a very easily treatable illness. It was all over the news. There was a big court case, and they ended up going to prison. And I saw how in the media these folks that I knew were vilified, and I understood it. And I had a lot of the same feelings about them. But at the same time, I knew that my father's family subscribes to a very small religious sect that does not believe in getting medical care because of religious reasons. And my father left that very early when he was around 20. So that was not what I grew up in, but I knew these folks. And this is the way they think. This is what their community is all about. This is what their parents and grandparents teach them. It's the water they swim in, the air they breathe. And so my cousin and his wife did something that when we step outside of that box is a terrible thing. When they were inside of it, their understanding was that they were being good parents. And that is the complexity of this particular stage. Because if you're in a framework, as I said, that has healthy choices that seem to be aligned with the rest of society and what we consider good, healthy choices, then it might be an okay framework to be in for your entire life, as many people are. But if people are in a framework that is not so healthy, that maybe is destructive toward other people or bigoted toward other people, then that's a really hard place for them to leave. But some people do, and they get to stage 4. And hello, stage 4, welcome to Unitarian Universalism. This is when a lot of people find us in stage 4. Another catchy name, the individuative reflective stage. This is where critical thinking comes into play. This is where people are also holding a lot of grief because they've left behind, in many cases, what they had before, including the relationships they had before. They lose relationships because they're no longer part of those communities that thought the way that they used to think. But now they have critical thinking that they've applied to that. They're starting to question things. And in this case, the moon might now be just something they're looking at scientifically. It's a satellite. It's something that they're looking at just from a critical lens. They've gotten rid of all of the faith-based ideas about it, and it is what it is. Now, this can be a wonderful, absolutely wonderful stage for learning about yourself and exploration. It can also be a stage where people hold grief and bitterness about what has come before and the relationships they've lost. And also, when we've cast aside an entire old framework and we're taking in a new framework, we can also be really rigid about that new framework that we're holding on to. So maybe we start rejecting all the supernaturalism that had been in our lives before, and we become very rigid and dogmatic in our new beliefs. Now we know what the truth is, and now we want every single person to know that exact truth, right? But this can be a healthy stage to be in, but it also, like all these stages, there can be places where it's not so healthy. So we then can move into, and this usually doesn't happen for people maybe until their 40s, but again, all these things can span different ages. It's the conjunctive stage, and this is where we start becoming more and more comfortable with paradox, more and more comfortable with tension. So we might know in this stage that yes, the moon is this thing there. We know all the scientific realities around it, but we're also comfortable with poetry about the moon. We're also comfortable playing around with stories about the moon. We might be comfortable, sitting and having a little meditative moment where we ponder the moon and so on. So we've become more capable of translation in this period. So we can sit next to somebody who maybe believes very differently than we do, but we can still talk and communicate with them and be comfortable with the differences in our beliefs. And this also is a place, these stages 4 and 5, where a lot of UUs are in. And if you think about the earlier stages, we're just not going to have people in our congregations coming to us in those earlier stages because it just wouldn't make sense for them to be here. The final stage that he talks about is the stage that he calls universalizing. And this stage, he says, is the rarest of all and may not be a stage that very many people live in, at least very much of the time. And it's a stage where we've kind of integrated all of this to the point where we're comfortable saying the moon is the moon. It's all of these things. The moon is the moon. We're comfortable with things just being as they are in terms of faith. It's not so much about having to name things or defend ourselves or argue about things anymore. We're just very comfortable in our being, in our place in the framework of all things. It's just a place of absolute sort of centered peace. That doesn't mean we don't work for justice and try to make things better in this place. In fact, he believes people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. had elements of this stage within themselves, and that helped to fuel them to do the work that they did, but also maintain a sense of being centered during all of this. So I think, you find that interesting? I find that really interesting, right, to think about these stages. And I think it's really important right now in the United States because a lot of what we're seeing in the divide are faith-based divides. And I think too often we think of it as one faith versus another faith or versus no faith. But the reality is it's not the any of the particular religions themselves that's the issue. It's the stage that people are in the various religions. That's actually where we find the friction and the tension and the inability to see one another's perspectives and understand where other folks might be coming from. I think any solutions to what's going on in our world today that don't take into account the different developmental stages that people are in, whether it's the moral, the cognitive, or the faith stages, those solutions are bound to fail, because they're assuming that everyone's starting from the same place, and we're just not. We're in different places, and that is okay. Sandra Cisneros is the author of The House on Mango Street, and she has a piece titled 11. And in that piece, she says that waking up on your 11th birthday, you're also 10, you're 9, you're 8, you're 7, you're 6, you're 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That we are like those Russian wooden dolls. She uses this image, those wooden dolls that open one bigger onto each other. And so we have all of our old selves within us at any given time. And what we've learned about Fowler's work since 1981 when it came out is that these stages are not actually discrete stages, that these are actually more like layers and phases, and they all exist within us at any given point in time. For instance, I know one time I got stuck not that long ago by the side of the road. And I was sitting there by the side of the road, and my car wouldn't start, and I said, I'm going to count to 3, and then turn the key, and this will start. That's magical thinking, right? So I reverted to that in a time of stress or chaos, and that's what happens to us as well. So some of the responses we see in the world are not even necessarily where people could be at or are at. It might be that in the chaotic times, in anxious times, they're tapping into some of those older stages of development that maybe they've moved beyond. So I think it's really important that we recognize that stages are not about some kind of superiority, that we don't just reach a place and we're there and look at these people, because we are all of these things at any given point in time. And I think we have to have a degree of compassion for people, meeting people where they are and understanding that and recognizing that. I think this is our work as UUs, is to continue to keep growing ourselves and also resist sneering at where people are, even as we offer judgment for the actions or the things that sometimes come out of where people are. But I think we also need to recognize that many people are being exploited where they are by powers that be. And so the powers that be will often try to reach people who are in some of those earlier stages of development and weaponize their way of thinking. So that's something that I think we have to be very cognizant of as UUs. And recognize that people may not be ready, you know. They may not be ready to see the moon the way you and I might see the moon. And we have to be at peace with that. Because in our lifetimes, that's always going to be the case, that there will always be people who see things differently because of the developmental stage that they are in. I think back to that monk who wanted so badly to give the thief this beautiful image of the moon. And I think maybe one of the things that makes my heart hurt during this time is as much as I get angry about the injustices and the things that are said and done, my heart hurts because I want to give people out there a vision of beloved community that is so different from what we have now. And it's hard sometimes to recognize that people aren't ready to take that in. And it's hard to be whole with that knowledge. But it's the truth of where we're at. So like that monk, we can long to give that beautiful, shining vision of the moon to others. But if they're not ready to see it and know it, then that's just the reality of where we're at. But what we can do in this time is we can keep shining ourselves. We can keep reflecting back the light within us. I see it as compassion and love and justice. And I think when we do that, that is an invitation. It's an invitation for people to come along, maybe, and catch a glimpse of what we see and know. And it has to be an invitation. We can't force anyone. But it is our calling as UUs to keep offering that light. May we shine and shimmer and glow with the light of that harvest moon tomorrow night. And may we learn to meet people where they are and continue to do our work of justice, but do so from a place that is centered and grounded and at peace, even in the midst of chaos.